Winter is coming. This one will be long, and dark things will come with it.
The icy victory. The Battle of Winterfell was a pivotal moment in the fight for survival in Westeros. The living stood united against the dead, desperate to stop the Night King and his army of the undead. In the canon timeline, Arya Stark's heroic strike saved humanity, delivering a decisive victory against impossible odds. But what if that strike never happened? What if Arya missed, Bran was killed, and the Night King triumphed? This alternate scenario imagines a darker fate for Westeros, one where the dead prevail, plunging the Seven Kingdoms into an endless winter. It's a chilling tale of what could have been, as we explore the devastating aftermath of the White Walkers' victory at Winterfell. This is the story of a world where the dead win. Chapter 1. The Fall of Winterfell. The night was darker than any Winterfell had ever known, the cold more biting than even the harshest northern winter. The defenders of the living, northerners, wildlings, unsullied, and knights of the Vale stood ready, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Fires lit the battlements, and the trenches around the castle burned bright, but the light seemed fragile, dwarfed by the encroaching shadow. When the dead came, they came like a tide, surging forward in an endless wave. The Dothraki charged first, their arachs glowing with fire, but they disappeared into the darkness, their screams echoing back. Those on the walls could only watch as their flames were snuffed out, one by one. Jon Snow stood at the forefront, Longclaw gleaming in his hand. "Hold the line, no one retreats." The dead crashed into the living with unrelenting force. The unsullied held their ground, their spears striking true, but for every wight that fell, two more seemed to rise. Arrows rained down from the battlements, and flaming catapults lit up the battlefield. But it wasn't enough. Rhaegal marched at Viserion, but the dragon couldn't overpower Viserion. It collapsed its wings, flinging on the air. Daenerys, perched atop Drogon, unleashed torrents of fire from above. The flames scorched hundreds of wights, but even her dragon's fury couldn't stop the tide. From the distance, the icy shriek of the undead dragon Viserion cut through the chaos, its blue flames tearing through the walls of Winterfell. Inside the Godswood, Theon Greyjoy and the Ironborn fought valiantly to protect Bran Stark. The sacred grove became a blood-soaked battlefield as wights climbed over the walls, their skeletal hands clawing for the three-eyed raven. Theon, bloodied and breathless, glanced back at Bran. "I'll keep them away, no matter what." But the frost crept closer, and soon the Godswood was overrun. Theon charged at the Night King, his battle cry echoing through the grove, but the icy figure sidestepped his attack and drove a spear through his chest. Theon fell lifeless at Bran's feet. Nearby, Arya leapt from the shadows, her dagger poised for the killing blow, but the Night King caught her mid-air. His icy grip crushed her throat, and she dropped lifelessly to the ground. With no one left to protect him, Bran fell moments later, the Night King's blade ending the three-eyed raven's legacy. The fall of the Godswood marked the end of the battle. Frost spread through Winterfell, extinguishing the last of the flames. Jon fought desperately, cutting down wight after wight, but he could see the tide turning. Grey Worm shouted commands to the Unsullied, but their lines were crumbling. Daenerys, seeing the battle lost, swooped down with Drogon, screaming at Jon. "Jon, there's nothing left. We have to go." Jon hesitated, his eyes darting to the crypts where his family sheltered, but the keep was already engulfed in flames. Screams echoed from within as Viserion's blue fire consumed the walls. His family was gone. With no choice, Jon climbed onto Drogon's back, his face hollow with grief. Grey Worm scrambled aboard as Drogon took flight, leaving Winterfell behind. From the air, they looked down at the ruins of Winterfell, now a frozen wasteland consumed by death and fire. The dead swarmed the courtyard, their blue eyes glowing like stars in the darkness. The Night King stood at the centre, his icy gaze fixed southward. Winterfell was lost, and the dead were on the march. Chapter 2: The March Southward. The north was silent. From Winterfell to White Harbour, every stronghold had fallen, consumed by frost and fire. The dead left nothing in their wake. No survivors, no signs of life, only a frozen wasteland that stretched endlessly under the pale light of the moon. The Night King marched at the head of his army, his presence an icy shadow over the lands of Westeros. Thousands of wights followed in perfect, unyielding silence, their blue eyes glowing like distant stars. Viserion, his undead dragon, circled overhead, its icy roars echoing across the frozen plains. Word of Winterfell's fall spread quickly. Refugees from the battle, those lucky enough to have fled before the dead overtook them, reached the southern castles with tales of despair. At Moat Cailin, a handful of survivors tried to make a stand, but the dead swept through the ancient fortress with ease. At White Harbour, the city's walls were no match for the Night King's dragon. The icy flames of Viserion tore through the harbour, leaving nothing but frozen ships and lifeless streets. From the safety of Dragonstone, Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen planned their next move. The survivors of Winterfell, now fewer than ever, gathered in the dim halls of the castle. The air was heavy with grief and fear. Daenerys paced before the great table, her face pale and drawn. "We cannot let this end here. The dead are heading south. If King's Landing falls, all of Westeros will be lost. They've already won. We couldn't stop them at Winterfell. We had everything. Dragons, armies, fire, and it wasn't enough. We fight until we can fight no more. That is the only way." But even Grey Worm's resolve seemed brittle. The memory of Winterfell's fall was fresh in all their minds. Chapter 3: Cersei and the Golden Company prepare.
Your Grace, I'm afraid I bring terrible news. The dead have broken through the wall.
At King's Landing, Cersei Lannister is having a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction by what happened in the north. Refugees poured into the city, spreading panic among the people. But for Cersei, this was an opportunity to secure her power. Let the Night King march south. Let him waste his army on the walls of King's Landing. The city has stood for centuries. It will not fall now. The wildfire caches are ready, Your Grace. Should the dead breach the gates, we will burn them and any who stand in their way. The Golden Company fortified the city, their soldiers stationed along the walls and battlements. But even their seasoned commander, Harry Strickland, looked uneasy as news of Viserion's icy flames reached him. We fought men before, but this is something else entirely. The Night King's army moved south without rest, leaving desolation in its path. The Riverlands, already weakened by years of war, were no match for the advancing dead. Harrenhal, Riverrun, and even the Twins fell in rapid succession. Survivors fled toward King's Landing, carrying with them stories of the dead's unstoppable march. Jon and Daenerys, realizing the urgency of the situation, took to the skies on Drogon, scouting the advancing army. The sight of the endless tide of whites chilled even Daenerys' fiery resolve. It doesn't end, does it? No matter how many we burn, there's always more. They're heading for the throne. That's what he wants. The dead were closer with each passing day, and with every city they claimed, the hope of stopping them slipped further away.
What does he want? An endless night. He wants to erase this world.
Chapter 4. The Battle for King's Landing. The capital of Westeros was in chaos long before the dead arrived. Refugees poured into the city, flooding the streets and overwhelming its defences. The gates of King's Landing were closed, but the whispers of the Night King's march spread like wildfire. Fear gripped the city as the horizon turned dark with frost and death. The Night King's army appeared on the outskirts of the city as a black, unrelenting tide. Whites stretched as far as the eye could see, their glowing blue eyes lighting the night. Viserion circled above, letting out a bone-chilling roar as his icy flames reduced nearby villages to ash.
The true enemy won't wait out the storm. He brings the storm.
On the city walls, the Golden Company prepared for battle. Soldiers lined the battlements, gripping their weapons tightly. Their commander, Harry Strickland, paced along the parapets. "Hold your positions. Remember your training. The city will not fall." Inside the Red Keep, Cersei Lannister watched from the balcony of her chambers, a goblet of wine in her hand. The Night King's army surged forward, crashing against the gates of King's Landing like a relentless tide. The Golden Company fired flaming arrows and catapulted stones, but the sheer number of whites was overwhelming. Within minutes, the outer walls were breached. Viserion descended, his icy flames tearing through the gates and reducing the city's defences to rubble. Civilians screamed as the undead poured into the streets, their skeletal hands tearing through anything that moved. The sounds of swords clashing and cries of terror filled the air as the defenders were pushed back. From above, Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen arrived on Drogon, flames bursting from the dragon's maw as they tried to stem the tide. Daenerys' face was grim as she directed Drogon to incinerate clusters of whites, but for every one they killed, dozens more took their place. "They're inside the city. We need to focus on the Night King. If we don't stop the army, there won't be a city left." In a desperate bid to halt the undead, Cersei ordered the release of wildfire hidden beneath the city. Explosions erupted across King's Landing, green flames consuming entire districts. Thousands of whites were obliterated, but so were civilians and soldiers. The Red Keep trembled as the blasts sent shockwaves through the city. Even the Night King paused briefly as the wildfire erupted, but as the flames died down, his army pressed forward, undeterred. The living were losing ground, and the dead were unstoppable. Chapter 5. The Final Stand. In the shadow of the Red Keep, Jon, Daenerys, and the last defenders of the city gathered for one final stand. Grey Worm, bloodied and exhausted, stood beside them with the remaining unsullied. "We fight to the end, for the living." the Night King appeared on Viserion, his icy figure a stark contrast to the burning city. He dismounted, his sword gleaming as he advanced toward the Iron Throne. Daenerys screamed in defiance as Drogon unleashed a torrent of fire, but the flames washed over the Night King harmlessly. Jon charged toward him, Longclaw raised, but the Night King's icy blade met his with brutal precision. The clash was short, and Jon was thrown aside, his strength no match for the Night King's power. The Red Keep began to collapse as Viserion's flames and wildfire consumed the structure. Cersei, trapped in the throne room, watched as the Iron Throne was frozen under the Night King's gaze. She let out a bitter laugh as the roof caved in, crushing her beneath the rubble. The Night King stood alone in the remains of the throne room, his icy presence freezing the air. He approached the Iron Throne, his hand reaching out to claim it. As he touched the seat of power, frost spread over the throne, encasing it in ice. Outside, Jon and Daenerys looked on from Drogon, helpless as the city fell completely. The dead roamed freely through the streets, their victory absolute. King's Landing was gone, and with it, the last hope for the living. Chapter 6. The Night King takes the throne.
Fear is for the winter, when the snows fall 100 feet deep. Fear is for the long night, when the sun hides for years, and children are born and live and die, all in darkness.
The Red Keep was a frozen ruin, its once majestic towers shattered, its halls silenced. The Iron Throne, the symbol of centuries of power and conflict, stood encased in ice, glinting faintly in the dim light. The city below, King's Landing, was no more, a lifeless shell of frost and fire, consumed by the relentless tide of death. In the throne room, the Night King stood motionless, his frosty gaze fixed on the frozen Iron Throne. His presence radiated cold, spreading ice across the stone floor in jagged veins. The wights that filled the room stood eerily still, their blue eyes fixed on him as if awaiting their master's next command. The dead had claimed victory. The living had fallen, their screams silenced by frost and blue fire. There were no challengers left, no armies to oppose him. The Night King stepped forward, his every motion deliberate, and placed his icy hand on the Iron Throne. The symbol of power in Westeros was now his, a trophy of his conquest. From the skies above the ruins of King's Landing, Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen watched in stunned silence from the back of Drogon. The dragon's mighty wings beat against the frozen air, but his movements were slower now, tired from the unrelenting battle. Below, the streets of King's Landing stretched out like a labyrinth of death, littered with frozen bodies and crawling with wights. Daenerys' face was streaked with ash and tears as she stared at the Red Keep, now a broken monument to her failed quest. It's over. The dead have won. There's no one left to save. Grey Worm, one of the few who managed to escape, sat behind them, his face blank with grief. The frost spread further south with each passing hour. Rivers froze solid, forests turned to icy wastelands, and fields of green were buried under a blanket of snow. Small towns and villages along the way were emptied, their residents turned into wights or forced to flee. The few survivors who made it out carried tales of despair, their voices trembling as they spoke of the Night King's icy dominion. The great houses of Westeros were no more. Winterfell, Riverrun, the Eyrie, Storm's End, all had fallen, their banners frozen in place. their halls silent. Those who had survived the wars for the Iron Throne now faced extinction under the rule of the dead. As the frost claimed King's Landing, the Night King's grip over Westeros solidified. The undead patrolled the streets of the capital, their movements slow and mechanical. The Red Keep, once the seat of human ambition and betrayal,
When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die.
was now a monument to death, its halls filled with silence and ice. In the throne room, the Night King sat upon the frozen Iron Throne, his gaze unblinking as he surveyed his dominion. The flames of war had been extinguished, replaced by the eternal cold of the long night. Far to the south, across the narrow sea, a handful of survivors regrouped in the free cities. Jon Snow, Daenerys Targaryen, and their remaining followers stared out across the ocean, the chill of defeat heavy on their shoulders. Daenerys clenched her fists, her voice trembling. We were supposed to break the wheel. Instead, we watched it freeze. We failed everyone. Westeros is lost. We can't let it end like this. We'll fight again, one way or another. But even her words felt hollow as they stared back toward the frozen shores of Westeros, knowing the long night had claimed the realm they once called home. The long night reigns. And so a new era began in Westeros, with the Night King seated upon the frozen Iron Throne. The long night claimed the realm entirely. What do you think? Could the living have stopped the Night King, or was this grim fate always inevitable? Was it their divisions and endless wars that led to this downfall, or something far beyond human control? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more Game of Thrones theories. Until next time, remember, when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you freeze.
What else did the book say?
The White Walkers sleep beneath the ice for thousands of years. And when they wake up,
And when they wake up, what?
I hope the wall's high enough.
The dead are coming.
Is this true?
Your uncle fought them at the Fist of the First Men. I fought them at Hardhome. We both lost.